I used to think the biggest threat to a defense contractor would be foreign hackers, industrial spies, or some hostile operator sitting in the dark, waiting to break through a perimeter. Then I learned the thing most capable of burning through firewalls. Procedures. And the future of thousands of employees was something far simpler and uglier: the arrogance of powerful people who believe the law exists for everyone except them. The day they fired me for protecting classified data, they thought they had removed the obstacle. What they never understood was that I was never the obstacle. I was the last barrier between them and the federal disaster already moving toward their door. I do not make friends at work. I trust audit logs more than polite smiles. Because people forget. People lie. And people rewrite their own motives to sleep at night. Audit logs do none of that. They tell the truth in the language I respect most: timestamps, access paths, source addresses, privilege escalations, abnormal traffic, and intent buried inside behavior. My name is Vivian Cross. I am 48 years old. And I serve as the Senior Cyber Compliance Officer at Ironclad Defense Systems. To some people, that title sounds dry. To the people who actually understand risk, it means I am the last woman standing between disciplined security and catastrophic executive stupidity. I spent 12 years in the Air Force working in signals and security analysis before moving into federal defense contracting. That adds up to 2 decades of living inside standards, protocols, and rules that many people dismiss as bureaucratic clutter until they learn those rules were written in the aftermath of real failures. At Ironclad, we do not sell office software or optimize ad campaigns. We handle military logistics data, route models, supply vulnerabilities, terrain-linked movement assessments, and projections that can affect whether soldiers receive what they need in time. The kind of information we protect is the kind that becomes deadly when it leaves the wrong room. That is why my mornings begin with lukewarm black coffee, glowing dashboards, and the kind of alertness that feels almost surgical. I have never treated this work like a salary with a badge attached. To me, it is simply the continuation of a mission. I may no longer wear a uniform, but I still live by the same principle. Protect the people who may never know your name from the consequences of people who think money, charm, or inherited authority make them untouchable. That is the mindset I carried into the office that Tuesday morning. At the time, I thought I was starting another ordinary day of review. I had no idea I was about to watch an entire leadership structure light a fuse beneath itself. That Tuesday morning felt gray in every possible way. The sky outside was dull. The building was still quiet. And I had already spent several hours reviewing event logs for Node 12, the most tightly protected server environment in the facility. If someone had asked me what was stored there, I would have answered with silence first. Some categories of data are better respected than described. It held military logistics intelligence so sensitive that exposure would not create a public relations problem. It could create field consequences. I was comparing network baselines against routine internal activity when I noticed a tiny fracture in the pattern. It was small at first, just a break in a line that should have remained flat. Then it sharpened into a spike. The sensation was immediate and physical. It felt like hearing a wrong note inside a song you know by heart. Most people would miss it. Someone trained to listen never would. I expanded the event chain, traced the authentication route, and checked the timestamp again. An unauthorized handshake had been initiated before dawn against the gateway connected to Node 12. At that hour, the building should have been locked down so tightly that nothing moved without documented authorization. Then I saw the account name. It was a legacy administrative key that should have been permanently disabled years earlier during a major compliance overhaul. Seeing it active on my screen was like finding a ghost in full uniform inside a secure operations room. I rechecked the status, verified the activity path, and confirmed the session state. No mistake. The account was live. My throat tightened. Not from fear, but from recognition. Ghost credentials do not revive themselves. Someone had deliberately opened a door that had no right to exist anymore. I kept reading. The pattern was already moving beyond passive probing. Whoever was behind the session was not brushing the fence out of curiosity. They were pressing against the perimeter as if they expected it to yield. In my line of work, There is a point where instinct stops being a vague feeling and becomes evidence-gathering speed. I reached that point in seconds. I knew I needed answers immediately. And I knew exactly who had to explain why a dead key had been brought back to life. I picked up the secure phone and called Daniel Mercer, our information technology director. Ethan is competent, and he has enough military background to understand the seriousness of a chain of command failure. But senior executives have always had a way of draining the steel out of his spine. I did not waste a second on pleasantries. I asked why a retired administrative credential had been reactivated and why it had just attempted to touch the outer layer of Node 12. There was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough to tell me I was about to hear something ugly. Ethan said he had not authorized the reactivation. The order came from the executive floor. The kind of order people describe carefully, because even repeating it feels dangerous. I asked who signed off. He hesitated, then gave me the name that made me close my eyes for half a second. Mason Cole. Brandon was the son of our chief executive officer, Victor Cole, newly installed as the company's chief innovation officer, despite having no meaningful security clearance and no record that justified the title. His resume was wrapped in trendy language about disruption, acceleration, and strategic vision. But underneath that glossy packaging was a trail of failed crypto ventures and oversized confidence. I asked Ethan, very calmly, why Brandon had root-level system privileges when he had no business being anywhere near compartmented military logistics data. Ethan told me Richard had personally come to his office the previous afternoon and insisted Brandon needed unrestricted access for an upcoming defense presentation. The explanation was that security controls were slowing down innovation. That sentence settled over me like ice. Suddenly, every separate concern aligned into one terrible picture. If you have ever watched an unqualified person get handed the keys just because they had the right last name. Comment number 1. People love to imagine disasters, begin with brilliant villains. Most of the time they begin with ordinary entitlement protected by family power and dressed up as confidence. As Ethan kept talking, I pulled up our access matrix and security clearance records. Brandon was nowhere near authorized for what he had touched. Not even close. At that moment, I stopped thinking in terms of office politics. This was not favoritism. It was not bad judgment. It was the beginning of a federal-grade security breach. And every second that passed without intervention made the damage harder to contain. After that call, I no longer saw the situation as an internal policy violation. In my mind, the entire risk framework assembled itself almost instantly. An unqualified executive family member had been granted elevated access to systems containing highly sensitive military logistics intelligence. That alone was enough to trigger severe compliance scrutiny. But what truly sent a chill through me was the next conclusion: the data might already be leaving the controlled environment. I pulled up access rights, compared live privilege mappings, and reviewed Brandon's clearance profile again. He did not possess the authority to view, manipulate, or transport the categories of information linked to Node 12. In my head, the language changed immediately. This was no longer a matter of process drift or misaligned approvals. This was legal exposure, contractual exposure, and national security exposure. It carried the potential to damage federal trust, destroy active programs, and drag the entire company into a crisis far beyond reputation. Then my primary screen flashed red. Alerts began appearing in rapid sequence, one after another, like tracer rounds. The activity had escalated beyond reconnaissance. A data extraction protocol had been initiated. The projected volume was massive, and the traffic path pointed outward. I stared at the numbers climbing and felt the kind of internal cold that only comes when you realize you are watching a controlled environment bleed in real time. This was not curiosity. This was wholesale exfiltration. I could have marched upstairs and pounded on Victor Cole's office door. I could have shouted, demanded explanations, or thrown policy language in his face. But reactions like that only work on people who still fear consequences. Richard did not, so I did the only thing that actually mattered. I moved to a hardened terminal isolated from the corporate network, authenticated into a secure channel, and began filing a priority incident report to the federal authorities with jurisdiction over this kind of compromise. I did not send it to human resources. I did not send it to the board. I sent it to the people who move when a defense contractor starts playing with classified fire. Every line I wrote was precise, factual, and stripped of emotion. Unauthorized access. Reactivated legacy credential. Sensitive military data at risk. Possible external transfer. Evidence attached. In moments like that, panic is useless. Documentation is everything. I knew I was setting something irreversible into motion. I also knew I was not the one who built the disaster. I was just the one still sober enough to call it by its real name. I remember the moment I finalized that report with almost unnatural clarity. My hands were steady. They usually are when things go bad. Crisis has always sharpened me instead of rattling me. I described the event chain with the kind of precision I trust more than any dramatic accusation: unauthorized access, legacy credential restoration, privileged system interaction, sensitive data extraction indicators, likely transfer beyond approved boundaries. I attached screenshots, timestamps, access evidence, and traffic traces. I made sure anyone reading it would understand that this was not a false alarm or a theoretical risk. It was already happening. When I sent it, I knew I had just triggered a sequence that could never be pushed back into silence. But I also knew something else. I was not the woman who had poured fuel under the structure. I was the woman identifying the fire before the ceiling collapsed. The next morning, the whole company received a mandatory all-hands invitation. The subject line included a rocket ship emoji and a phrase about an innovation breakthrough. I have always hated that kind of childish branding in environments tied to military data. It feels obscene. Like using party confetti at the edge of an emergency. We gathered in the main conference room, a polished monument of steel, glass, and contractor money. Victor Cole stood at the front, radiating the confidence of a man who believed money had always been a substitute for gravity. Beside him stood Brandon, dressed like he was headed to a startup pitch instead of a defense-linked internal briefing. The room felt wrong before anyone spoke. People kept glancing toward me and then looking away. They did not know everything, but they knew something had shifted. I stayed where I was with my arms folded and my expression flat. The way I learned to hold myself years ago, when emotion would only distract from observation. If you have ever watched the person breaking everything become the person holding the microphone, like the video. Justice does not always arrive immediately. But truth is usually already on its way while the applause is still happening. As Richard prepared to speak, I realized the company was about to commit a second mistake nearly as destructive as the first. The theft itself was one thing. Publicly glorifying it as progress would become the confession no defense team could ever erase. Richard opened the meeting with the kind of language powerful men use when they want recklessness to sound visionary. He said the company had spent too long operating defensively. He said we had prioritized safety too much. He said compliance had become a brake on growth. Every time he said the word compliance, I heard contempt under the polish. A few people looked at me, but I did not move. Silence can be very useful when someone else is busy exposing themselves. Then Brandon took the floor. He adjusted a pair of decorative glasses, held his tablet like a prop in a badly cast innovation documentary, and launched into a breathless speech about how he had spent recent days deep diving into our systems. He said he was shocked by compartmentalization, shocked by air-gapped thinking, shocked by the idea that valuable information was being restrained instead of liberated. Listening to him was like hearing a motivational speaker wander into a munitions depot and start talking about creative freedom. Then he said, the part that froze the room. Brandon proudly announced that he had extracted raw data from Node 12 and integrated it with a commercial artificial intelligence platform to build a real-time military advisory capability. There was no applause. There was no admiration. There was just silence, dense and horrified. Engineers stared at the table. Project managers looked toward me with expressions that mixed dread with helplessness. In one careless stretch of ego, Brandon had publicly confessed to removing highly sensitive military intelligence from a secure environment and pushing it toward a commercial platform. Then he pointed at me. He called me a symbol of outdated thinking, a guardian of buried systems, a woman obsessed with locks and walls while he represented speed and transformation. I did not feel insulted. Mostly, I felt something close to pity. Brandon was too ignorant to understand that he was not dismantling my relevance. He was announcing his own collapse in front of witnesses. Richard, of course, reinforced the performance. He praised Brandon's boldness and talked about forward motion, as though legal exposure were a branding problem instead of a federal one. The whole thing would have been absurd if it had not been so dangerous. In that moment, I understood something with complete certainty. They did not just believe they were safe. They believed the very concepts of secrecy, discipline, and lawful restriction were old burdens, meant for lesser people. That kind of arrogance is uniquely destructive because it cannot even recognize the shape of consequence until consequence is physically in the room. When the meeting ended, people dispersed with that strange, quiet energy that follows an event everyone knows is wrong but no one dares name aloud. Nobody chatted like they had just witnessed a breakthrough. They moved quickly, avoided one another's eyes, and returned to their desks with the tense body language of people who know they have just stood too close to a future explosion. I went straight back to my office, closed the door, and did what I always do when performance ends and evidence begins. I reopened the logs. Every layer. Authentication shine. Privilege transitions. Physical access records. Packet traces. Outbound traffic paths. Command sequences. Event correlations. Brandon had not exaggerated for effect. He had done exactly what he claimed. Before dawn, the revived legacy credential had launched bulk extraction commands against our most sensitive repositories. The outbound stream then routed toward a young artificial intelligence company, sitting well outside our approved security perimeter. I stared at the destination information and almost laughed from the sheer insanity of it. A defense contractor had allowed the chief executive's son to funnel military-sensitive data toward a commercial AI environment and call it strategic innovation. I preserved everything. Screenshots. Packet analysis. Timeline reconstruction. Meeting footage capturing Brandon's own verbal confession. Then I sent an updated priority report to Agent Nathan Stone, the federal contact I had worked with before. Graham is not a man built for warmth. Every sentence from him sounds measured, heavy, and final. His response arrived almost immediately. Report received. Federal response in motion. Maintien passive surveillance. Do not intervene. That instruction was the hardest part. I had to sit there while Brandon wandered the building glowing with self-congratulation, convinced he had become some kind of transformational genius. Everything in me wanted to rip the power out of the wall and shut him down before he touched another bite. But discipline is not just acting at the first moment you feel justified. Sometimes, discipline means holding still, because a larger mechanism is locking into place. I watched him celebrate. I watched executives nod around him like he had discovered fire instead of spilling gasoline. And through all of it, I kept my face neutral and my hands steady. Because I knew something Brandon did not. Federal systems were already moving. He still thought he was driving the story. In reality, he had become the target package. A couple of hours later, my secure desk phone rang with a pattern that felt more ominous than urgent. The call was from Laura Bennett, our Vice President of Human Resources. Sophie decorated her office with soft colors and motivational quotes, but I had seen enough of her over the years to know she could terminate someone with the same emotional temperature she used to approve office catering. She told me to come to her office immediately and to bring my badge and credentials. In corporate language, that sentence means only one thing. I walked down the corridor past rows of engineers trying to force Brandon's artificial intelligence mess into systems that had never been built for reckless showmanship. Nobody said anything. Fear has a texture in workplaces like that, even when it makes no sound. When I entered Sophie's office, Richard was standing by the window, looking out over the parking lot like a man rehearsing control. Brandon was seated nearby, tapping at his phone with the boredom of someone irritated that adults were still discussing consequences. I sat down, straight-backed, hands composed, military calm intact. Richard said the company had been evaluating culture and future direction. Then he informed me that my visible disapproval during the meeting, my negative body language, and my failure to support leadership had damaged organizational authority. I told him, evenly, that I had said nothing at all during the presentation. Brandon cut in and said that was the problem. According to him, my silence was threatening. My presence was judgmental. And my energy was toxic to innovation. I looked straight at him and said what no one else in that room had the courage to say. Plainly uploading classified military logistics intelligence to a commercial AI environment is not innovation. It is criminal behavior. The room went cold. Sophie slid the paperwork toward me and informed me that I was being terminated for insubordination and for creating a hostile workplace environment. They offered me a token severance package if I signed a silence agreement. I refused. I removed my badge and placed it on the desk with more dignity than they deserved. Then I told Richard he was making a strategic mistake. If you believe the person who tells the truth should never be forced into silence, subscribe to the channel. Sometimes walking out that door is not defeat. Sometimes it is the exact moment truth begins walking in from the other side. Richard smirked. Brandon looked relieved. Neither of them understood that my firing was not the end of my role in their downfall. It was the final confirmation federal authorities needed. The walk out of that building felt longer than it ever had before. Even though the distance had not changed, Mike, the security guard who had accepted Friday donuts from me for years, followed behind as my assigned escort without once lifting his eyes to meet mine. I did not blame him. The middle layers of an organization usually see injustice with perfect clarity and possess almost no power to stop it. The glass doors sealed behind me, and the warm outside air hit my face, like a blunt reminder that the world keeps moving even when your professional life has just been shoved off a ledge. I reached my truck, opened the door, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The silence inside that cab was heavy and complete. No alerts, no screens, no status indicators. No one calling me obstructive. Just a brief, hollow feeling that anyone with a conscience would recognize after being forced away from something they were trying to protect. But that hollow space did not last. My encrypted device vibrated. The message was from Agent Nathan Stone. He asked for immediate confirmation of my employment status. I responded with the facts. Terminated. Badge surrendered. Access revoked. His reply came back almost instantly. Effective immediately. I was being treated as a protected federal witness. I was to return home, maintain normal behavior, and await further instructions. I read the message twice. Not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted my body to catch up with its meaning. The situation had fully crossed the line from internal corporate corruption to active federal response. Richard and Brandon still believed they had removed the problem. In reality, they had pushed the last internal barrier out of the building, just as federal accountability was stepping in. As I drove away, I glanced up toward the upper windows and caught a glimpse of Brandon moving animatedly behind the glass. Probably still selling someone on his fantasy of revolutionizing modern defense with tools he barely understood. He looked triumphant. That image stayed with me all the way home. Not because it hurt, but because it clarified everything. The truly dangerous people are often the ones smiling at the exact moment their collapse has already begun. I drove in silence. No music. No calls. No self-pity. A firing can end a job. It cannot stop an investigation. And by then, that investigation had already wrapped around them like wire. My house has the kind of quiet I have always preferred. My daughter was away, pursuing graduate study, which meant most evenings belonged to me. A kitchen lamp, a strong cup of coffee, and enough stillness for my thoughts to settle into order. That afternoon, while steam was still curling up from a fresh pour, my hardened laptop signaled an incoming encrypted call. I sat down, authenticated the handshake, and waited for the connection to lock. Agent Nathan Stone appeared on the screen, his face carrying the same granite severity. It always did. He wasted no time. Graham told me the federal team had completed a full network mirror of Ironclad's infrastructure and had maintained continuous surveillance of Brandon's activity. For hours, Brandon had been trying to integrate military logistics databases with public language model interfaces, believing he was building some kind of revolutionary artificial intelligence advisor. What he did not know was that his connection had already been isolated and redirected. The environment he thought was the open internet was actually a controlled simulation built by the government. Every packet he sent, every prompt he issued, every data flow he initiated was being captured inside a federal containment framework. That was the first moment all day I felt any real reduction in pressure. Then Graham told me the next day's Pentagon liaison meeting would serve as the operational endpoint. The timing was perfect, he said. The right officials would be present, and so would federal assets. Then he said something I did not expect to hear. I was being activated as a specialized consultant under federal authority. In plain terms, the company had just stripped me of access, and the government had immediately put me back in the mission. I asked what was needed from me. Graham said the hardest thing for someone like me would be doing almost nothing. I was to arrive before the meeting, park across from the building, monitor the feed he would provide, and wait for his signal. No premature intervention, no attempts to fix the network, no warning calls, just presence and patience. That is harder for me than most people understand. My instincts are built around closing holes, blocking traffic, and shutting down failure before it spreads. But sometimes the right action is not repair. Sometimes the right action is letting a corrupt structure reveal itself so completely that nobody can bury the evidence afterward. I ended the call understanding that my job the next day would not be to save Brandon. It would be to witness exactly what happened when accountability finally reached him. That evening, I spent more time thinking than moving. I sat alone in my kitchen and replayed the entire arc of the last 24 hours, the spike in the logs, Ethan's uneasy confession, Brandon's public arrogance, Richard's smug certainty, Sophie's paperwork, the walk to my truck, the message confirming I was now under federal protection. What struck me most was how little bitterness I actually felt. Anger. Yes. Disgust. Certainly. But not bitterness. Maybe that comes with age. Or with years of service. At some point you stop needing vindication from the people who wronged you. You start caring only about whether reality is still strong enough to overrule them. I opened the cabinet where I keep my service firearm secured and cleaned it with the kind of methodical care that has always steadied me. I had no intention of using it. The ritual itself was the point. Strip. Inspect. Wipe. Reassemble. There is something grounding about precise movements when everything around you has been contaminated by carelessness. Afterward, I chose the sharpest white shirt I owned, pressed every line clean, and set it aside for morning. Old military habits never really leave. When the moment comes, you prepare. The next day, I arrived early. Of course I did. I parked in the visitor lot across from Ironclad and placed my tablet on the passenger seat. Graham had already sent access credentials for the surveillance stream. Inside the conference room, the setup looked almost celebratory. Silver trays, catered pastries, coffee arranged with unnecessary elegance. Richard paced near the windows, rehearsing confidence. Brandon was connecting his laptop to the massive display. Clearly thrilled with himself, I could hear pieces of their conversation through the audio feed. Brandon bragged that his system could model strategic disruption in seconds. Richard praised him for representing the future while dismissing my team as old methodology. Listening to them was surreal. They were discussing wealth, influence, and the contracts they expected to win while standing on top of an active federal case. I stayed in my truck and watched them prepare as if the day belonged to them. That image mattered to me. Sometimes the clearest portrait of arrogance is not rage. It is confidence at the exact moment disaster has already entered the building and just has not announced itself yet. As the scheduled hour approached, one of the camera feeds shifted to the lobby, and I saw Colonel Amelia Hayes enter the building. She wore her uniform with the kind of effortless authority that does not need amplification. Her ribbons were immaculate, her posture exact, and the people around her naturally adjusted their own movement the moment she passed. 2 military aides followed close behind, carrying locked cases. But the real change in the atmosphere came a few seconds later. 2 dark vehicles rolled into position outside. Then Agent Nathan Stone and his team stepped out. Even through camera distance, there was no mistaking what they were. They moved with clean purpose, splitting coverage across the entrance, elevator access, and exit routes with practiced precision. At the reception desk, Claire Dawson looked up with her usual bright professionalism. Graham must have shown credentials, because her expression changed instantly. She did not reach for a phone or try to challenge them. She simply stepped back with the reflex of someone who understood the building had just changed hands in every way that mattered. Upstairs, Richard and Brandon were still adjusting slides and rehearsing triumph. They had no idea how narrow their remaining window had become. Brandon flashed an excited grin at his father. Richard straightened his tie like a man about to secure a fortune. Watching them through the feed, I felt something colder than satisfaction. It was the quiet recognition that some people reveal their truest selves not when they are under pressure, but when they think success is seconds away. My phone vibrated. Graham's text was brief. The building was secure. I could enter. I turned off the screen, drew in one measured breath, and stepped out of the truck. The sunlight felt surprisingly bright. Birds crossed the sky. Traffic continued normally. The ordinary beauty of the afternoon made the moment even sharper. The world was not darkening for justice. It was simply making space for it. I crossed the street at a steady pace, not rushing. After everything that had happened, I wanted to enter that building as myself, with nothing frantic in me. Fear had done enough damage already. Now it was time for structure, evidence, authority, and the clean force of consequence to do what they were built to do. I crossed the street without hurrying. After everything, I wanted to walk back into that building at the pace of a woman who no longer needed anybody's permission to know she had been right. The main doors opened, and cool lobby air moved across my face. Hannah was still behind the reception desk. Both hands braced against the surface, as if she were holding herself steady. When she saw me, her eyes widened. She whispered that she thought I had been fired for good. I told her, as gently as I could, that things were about to become very clear. Then I asked whether she could override the elevator lockout. Hannah glanced toward the federal team, then back at me. In that brief pause, I could see the calculation behind her eyes, fear on one side, trust on the other. So I asked her quietly if she trusted me. She nodded. That was all. One honest nod from a woman who had watched enough office theater to know the difference between truth and spin. She swiped her master access card, and the elevator doors opened with a soft mechanical click. Before stepping in, I told her she might want to take a very long lunch break. It was partly strategy and partly kindness. She had chosen the right side at the right moment, and I wanted her away from the blast radius of what was coming. The elevator ride was silent except for the hum of the cables. As the floor indicators climbed, I noticed how calm my heartbeat had become. That did not mean I felt nothing. It meant I had reached the point beyond argument. I was no longer there to win a conversation. I was there to witness consequence. When the doors opened, the corridor was empty. Brandon's voice carried out from the conference room, loud and polished and stuffed with the jargon he always used when he wanted to sound deeper than he was. I moved quietly toward the doorway and stayed just outside the frame, hidden enough to observe. He was in full performance mode, talking about real-time intelligence synthesis, transformational capability, and the death of outdated restrictions. Richard was feeding him approval at every pause. Father and son, perfectly synchronized in their delusion. I stood there listening, and something in me grew unexpectedly peaceful. Not because the damage was small, it was not, but because for the first time since that spike appeared on my monitor, I knew the ending was no longer in the hands of people like them. The moment the conference room doors opened wider, the entire atmosphere changed. Agent Nathan Stone entered first, followed by federal personnel and the military delegation. No one needed to shout. Their presence alone was enough to transform Brandon's innovation showcase into an enforcement scene. He stopped mid-sentence with one hand still near the keyboard. Richard turned sharply, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something close to disbelief on his face. It was the expression of a man discovering that wealth can delay scrutiny, flatter ego, and purchase access, but it cannot negotiate away evidence once the right people are holding it. I remained just outside the main line of sight, watching everything unfold. Graham identified himself, stated, federal authority, and laid out the basis for immediate action with the kind of unembellished clarity only professionals use. Brandon tried to speak over him, stumbling through phrases about misunderstanding, progress, and strategic value. Richard attempted to recover his executive composure, shifting instinctively toward the tone of a man accustomed to controlling rooms through confidence alone. But this was no longer a room built for him. The data had been captured. The transfer attempts were documented. The confession existed on video. The The simulation trap had preserved every move. There is a specific kind of relief that comes when the truth no longer needs your voice, because it has acquired its own momentum. That is what I felt in that room. Not gloating. Not revenge. Relief. As federal agents moved forward, Richard still made a final attempt at dignity, straightening his collar, as if posture might undo criminal exposure. Brandon looked stripped of all the synthetic certainty he had worn like a costume. They were placed in restraints and escorted out while the rest of the room stood silent. No one defended them. No one demanded patience. By then, even the people who had chosen fear over courage understood that this had moved beyond office politics and into the realm where facts harden into consequences. I stepped nearer the window as they were led downstairs. From above, Richard's expensive suit could not disguise what he had become. Brandon's branded shirt suddenly felt almost poetic. He had wanted disruption. He got it. Watching them leave, I understood something I have never forgotten since. Justice does not always need spectacle. Sometimes it arrives in a calm voice, a legal warrant, a secured hallway, and a pair of hands finally reaching the people who believed they could never be touched. After the vehicles left, the executive floor entered a state of structured panic. Phones came out. Lawyers were called. Doors were secured. The board was summoned. People who had spent months orbiting power suddenly looked uncertain about where power lived now. I did not throw myself into the chaos. I stood back, breathed deeply, and let my body catch up with the truth that had finally arrived. For the first time in 2 days, I felt like my lungs had room again. Not long after, Thomas Reed, the chairman of the board, asked to speak with me privately. Jacob had never been someone I would have described as brave. But that day, he was at least honest enough to recognize wreckage when he saw it. We stepped into a temporary office, and he wasted very little time with ceremonial language. He said the board had convened in emergency session. He said the company needed someone with actual credibility, actual expertise, and actual authority to rebuild trust with federal stakeholders and stabilize internal security. Then he made the offer. He wanted me back. Not in my previous role, but as Chief Security Officer with full operational autonomy over security and compliance matters. I did not answer immediately. There are moments when people expect gratitude, but gratitude was not the relevant emotion in that room. I asked him the only questions that mattered. What exactly would my authority cover? Who would I report to? Could future executive leadership bypass security standards through informal directives? Would I have the power to stop any decision that created unacceptable risk? Jacob answered, carefully. And more importantly, he did not dodge. That mattered. I knew I was not considering the role because I wanted emotional closure after being fired. I was considering it because organizations like this become even more dangerous when the competent people decide to walk away forever. Thousands of employees who had done nothing wrong still depended on ironclad surviving. The systems still held data that could not be mishandled again. And if people like me abandoned the structure completely, some louder, richer, less disciplined, fool would eventually occupy the vacuum. So I accepted. Jacob visibly exhaled, like a man watching a damaged bridge regain one of its load-bearing supports. I did not experience the moment as personal triumph. To me, it felt like reassignment. There was a wounded system in front of me. There were innocent livelihoods tied to it. There were security principles that had been mocked, ignored, and nearly destroyed. My job now was not to celebrate being vindicated. My job was to make sure no family empire ever got that close to burning us down again. 6 months later, I sat in the same office where Richard had once dismissed me as outdated. The view through the window had not changed much, but everything inside the company had. On my desk lay the latest quarterly security assessment, thick, orderly, and finally trustworthy. Sometimes, while reading, I would lift my eyes toward the federal courthouse in the distance and think about how quickly arrogance collapses once it is forced to stand under oath. Victor Cole eventually pleaded guilty to serious federal violations tied to the security breach and misuse of protected military data. Brandon did not escape either. He received his own sentence, lost every meaningful path to security clearance, and watched the future his father had tried to purchase for him vanish in public. But what felt most just to me was not only that they paid, it was that the people who had tried to do right were finally seen. Daniel Mercer was promoted after fully cooperating and helping rebuild access governance the right way. Claire Dawson moved into a stronger role after handling the crisis day with more composure than half the executive floor. Engineers who had spent months quietly enduring chaos were finally able to do their jobs without being ordered to support ego projects disguised as innovation. And the company itself did not die. In fact, once leadership was replaced and the security posture was rebuilt with real seriousness, federal confidence began returning faster than many expected. It turns out government partners are not frightened by competent security. They are reassured by it. I have never forgotten the day I was escorted out as though I were the one poisoning the room. But I do not live inside resentment. I live inside confirmation. Systems can still work. Even slow systems. If enough people refuse to bow forever to entitlement. Every time I look down at the parking lot where I once sat reading the message that made me a protected witness, I remember that what felt like an ending was actually a transfer point. Truth did not stop moving that day. It just changed vehicles and kept going until it reached the people who thought they were beyond reach. That is the part many arrogant people never understand. Delay is not escape. Silence is not safety. And humiliation, when deserved, can arrive with extraordinary precision. Sometimes I still hear Richard's voice in memory, calling me legacy equipment, an outdated remnant of a slower age. People like him are very clever with language. They call principle rigidity. They call restraint inefficiency. They call discipline obstruction. It is the easiest way to avoid admitting they cannot clear a wall built by competence. So they redefine the wall as the problem. I sat in that room and listened as he reduced 2 decades of experience to a cultural inconvenience simply because I refused to smile at criminal behavior. The longer I thought about it afterward, the more I understood that it was never really about me as a person. It was the reflex of a man who could not overpower expertise. So he tried to brand expertise as obsolete. I am not someone who measures my value by praise. Years in this field cured me of that early. Real worth is not applause when you enter a room. Real worth is what remains protected when you leave it. Is the data still secure? Are the soldiers still unseen by hostile eyes? Are the contracts still intact? Do ordinary employees still have jobs because someone held the line when it mattered? That has always been my metric. By that standard, I knew exactly who I was, even on the day they fired me. That is why I never felt that Richard had stripped me of my identity. He had stripped me of a badge and access to a building. He had not touched the mission underneath either one. I was still the woman who had worn a uniform. Still, the woman who understood that a small failure in an office can become a major failure in the field. Still, the woman who knew some mistakes are paid for by people who never got a vote in making them. So when I sit in this office now, I do not think of it as revenge. I think of it as proof. You can be mocked. You can be sidelined. You can be labeled old-fashioned by people who confuse noise with intelligence, but if you are standing on the side of truth, time eventually forces arrogance to trip over reality. And when it does not matter how expensive the suit is. The floor still feels the same on the way down. People have asked me why I am so uncompromising about process, why I insist on layered approvals, strict access boundaries, formal review channels, and hard stops, even when executives complain that everything would move faster if I loosened up. I never get angry at those questions. Most people asking them have never seen the far end of a preventable mistake. They have never watched a risk indicator climb and understood that somewhere down the line, it might translate into a delayed convoy, a compromised route, a failed deployment, or a real human being, exposed because someone inside an office wanted convenience more than discipline. I do not romanticize what I do. I am not the one standing in the field. I am not the one taking direct fire. But I know that the invisible systems I protect shape decisions that affect people who are. That is why when Brandon called security an obstacle and Richard treated compliance like a nuisance to be softened for a presentation, I did not hear a difference of opinion. I heard contempt for consequence. The deepest pain in this story was never my termination. What hurt more was recognizing that people with immense authority could sit that high in an organization and still lack the basic humility to respect outcomes larger than their own ambition. They treated law as if it existed to inconvenience them. In reality, Law exists to protect the people who are not privileged enough to survive reckless error. Soldiers in the field do not get to beta test failure. Logistics chains do not get to pivot after exposure. Human lives do not recover because an executive sends an apology memo after experimenting with arrogance. So when I continue signing off on stronger controls, rejecting flashy but irresponsible shortcuts, and forcing hard conversations about access and accountability, I am not doing it because I enjoy controlling other people. I do it because somewhere beyond all these walls are people I may never meet. And they deserve at least one stranger in a secure building who takes her part of the mission seriously. That is the moral line I live by now more than ever. Rules are not there to flatter careful people. They are there to restrain careless ones, before the careless decide everybody else can absorb the cost. The first weeks after my return were a true reconstruction effort, not the decorative kind executives love to turn into slides, but the real kind that starts by digging into every dangerous assumption left rotting under the floorboards. I ordered a complete review of privilege architecture. Shut down every legacy account without active and justified need. Rebuilt segmentation around sensitive systems. Implemented zero-trust access principles. And moved all elevated permissions into layered approval paths that could not be bypassed by verbal leadership direction. I wanted to make sure no future Brandon could drift through the structure just because his father liked calling recklessness progress. We added biometric controls for the most sensitive areas, strengthened encryption standards to a stricter federal posture, and rebuilt threat detection around behavioral anomalies rather than old static patterns alone. I also required broad retraining across technical and management teams on what it actually means to safeguard defense-linked information. Security could no longer be treated like a department's private burden. In environments like ours, if only one group understands the risk while everyone else lives on slogans, collapse is just a matter of timing. Some people complained that I was tightening too hard. I listened and kept going. Experience has taught me that the people who think a system is too restrictive are usually the people who have never had to shovel the rubble after it was too loose. But to be fair, once the new controls proved they were built to protect rather than punish, resistance dropped. Engineers began reporting irregularities earlier. Project managers stopped trying to finesse standards in private. Truly capable people usually prefer environments with rules, because rules prevent success from being stolen by the loudest person in the room. These days when I walk the floors, the feeling is different. Not because everything is perfect. Perfection is a dangerous fantasy. But because the company is no longer living inside a delusion, we understand what we hold. We understand what it would mean to lose it. And we understand that security is not the brake that keeps a company from growing. It is the frame that keeps the company from driving off a cliff while congratulating itself on speed. That clarity did not come cheaply. But now that it exists, I intend to make it permanent. Some victories arrive with lights, applause, and public celebration. Mine did not. Mine tastes like slightly cooled black coffee at dawn, like a thick report on my desk, like the quiet relief of knowing the data is still where it belongs, and people far away will not suffer, because someone in a corner office mistook arrogance for genius. I do not need Richard or Brandon to confess to me personally for this story to feel complete. Their convictions, the company's survival, and the rebuilt security framework say everything that matters. Sometimes I think back to the first moment it began. The instant I saw that abnormal spike on a traffic graph and understood that a hand without the right to touch our systems was already reaching inward. Everything that followed was, in a way, just the long unfolding of a very old rule. When qualified people warn and entitled people dismiss them, collision becomes inevitable. The only variable is how much damage occurs before reality forces the bill onto the people who created it. These days, my mornings look almost the same as they once did. Screens come alive. Locks scroll. Coffee waits by my right hand. But something inside me is different now. I am no longer standing alone in front of a culture, so corrupted it, mocked the principles, keeping it alive. I am leading a system that learned its lesson through a brutally expensive failure and will remember it for a very long time. Competence must stand above connection. Expertise must stand above noise. Law must stand above lineage. And if anyone asks what I ultimately took from all of this, my answer is simple. Some lessons are paid for in money. Some are paid for in reputation. But when people deliberately treat limits as decorations, Some lessons are paid for in federal restraints, prison sentence, and futures that close like steel doors. As for me, I just keep doing the work. Sam mission. Same duty. Protect people who will never see my face from those who always think they are beyond reach. That has always been enough for me. And on the right morning, with the right logs clean and the right systems holding, it still feels like victory.